The Delphi Economic Forum, held annually around the corner from where the sages and seers of ancient times contemplated the future of civilization, is not usually consumed by consideration of the transatlantic alliance. This is partly because of where Delphi is. The forum's usual ambit is the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans, theatres in which there is usually more than enough for delegates to be getting on with. But that is also because of what the transatlantic alliance is, or was until a few weeks ago, a geostrategic fact of life, reliable and immutable. This year's Delphi Economic Forum, where this episode was recorded, was not like that. In the days before it opened, US President Donald Trump launched and then only partially retreated from a global trade war of which the EU was a target. This followed a series of threats to and taunts of Europe by this US administration, up to and including explicit threats to annex, by force if necessary, the territory of one EU and NATO member. Given that, the idea of the US invading Greenland makes no more or less sense than the idea of the US invading Crete or Sicily, or indeed delivering a wooden horse to Troy, Europe has been forced to start thinking the previously unthinkable. This special episode of Delphi Economic Forum Highlights assesses the scale of the task now facing Europe, a group of countries who doubtless prefer to believe that the US is still a trusty friend and staunch ally, but are having to ponder the alternative. We'll meet the Prime Minister of the host nation, a former Prime Minister of another European country confronted by the same dilemma, and from the Atlantic's other shore, someone with some ideas about how the US might possibly once again become the US that Europe had gotten used to. What is it like trying to govern an EU and NATO country as the diplomatic order is upended? What are Europe's options? And how might the Atlantic be stopped from getting any wider? This is the Foreign Desk.
In every crisis, I want to see the possible opportunities, and certainly the last 2 months have been, in a sense, a sort of rude awakening for the European Union.
We can't leave the free trade die because of President Trump's decisions. It's too dangerous, especially for us, for the European economy.
If the economy continues to go down and we're heading into a recession with his back and forth on tariffs, I think people won't vote for him. Republicans won't vote for him, so he won't win.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Kyriakos Mitsotakis, Prime Minister of Greece. Prime Minister, welcome back to The Foreign Desk. Is there a way you can describe what it is like trying to be the Prime Minister of an EU and NATO nation these last couple of months?
Complicated and challenging. But I guess in every crisis, I want to see the possible opportunities, and certainly the last 2 months have been, in a sense, a sort of rude awakening for the European Union, especially for those of us who have been making the case for Europe's strategic autonomy. I'm happy to see that at least some progress has been made in terms of the decisions that we have taken at the level of the European Council.
Where do you see those opportunities, though? Is this in the idea of a more united, more cohesive Europe?
Well, at the end of the day, we have to realize that the strategic challenges that we have to address require bold decisions. And when I'm talking about bold decisions, obviously, I'm also talking about financing and about putting money on the table, especially when it comes to defense. For example, I have been advocating for more fiscal flexibility at the national level in order to finance defense spending for quite some time. When I first raised this issue, my colleagues were not ready to move down that path. I'm happy to see now that the progress is being made in that direction. We have a new financial instrument, SAFE. It's 150 billion euros of loans, which is not my preferred solution, but at least it's a step in the right direction. And for the first time, I see countries such as Finland openly talking about exploring all financial options to finance projects of common interest when it comes to European defense. So in a sense, This reminds me a little bit of the months before we agreed the next generation EU plan, when many countries were against this idea, only to come on board at the very, very last moment.
But do you think Europe has got past the point in the last couple of months in particular, and perhaps especially since Vice President Vance's speech at Munich, of taking the United States for granted? Is there now a sense dawning among European countries that maybe that relationship is not coming back? Maybe Donald Trump isn't a glitch?
Well, I think it's almost a cliche to make the point that for many, many years Europe has been taking its security guarantee for granted, in the sense that we have not spent as much as we should on our own defense. Greece is the exception to that rule because of our particular security concerns. We have always been spending more than 2% of our GDP on defense, and this argument has been made by President Trump back in 2017. So this is not something which is new. Having said that, Europe is currently not in a position to replace NATO and the U.S. dominant role within the alliance when it comes to our own collective security. So certainly we need to work very hard to keep the United States on board, while recognizing at the same time that we need to do more to protect ourselves. And I think we are moving in that direction, maybe not at the pace that I would like, but certainly progress has been made.
On the subject, though, of Greece's particular situation, as you delicately put it, would Greece have anything, do you think, to teach Denmark or maybe Canada about how to manage difficult relations with a NATO ally?
Well, let's say our history with Turkey goes back centuries. It is a complicated relationship. I do believe that at the end of the day, two things need to happen. On the one hand, Greece needs to present a very, very credible deterrence in terms of defending our sovereignty and our sovereign rights, and that is why we are heavily investing in modernizing our armed forces. At the same time, one needs to explore pathways towards building a more productive relationship, even if that means not addressing the complicated underlying issue, which is at the heart of our dispute with Turkey, which is the delimitation of maritime zones in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean, where frankly we have not made any significant progress. So even if we agree to disagree on important issues, that does not mean that we need to be constantly at each other's throats, nor does it mean that we cannot explore opportunities to strengthen our relationship on other fronts. And it certainly requires honest and open channels of communication, which I think we have established with Turkey at all levels. And I think it's important, even when we disagree, to be able to openly talk to each other.
But has there been much conversation among EU and NATO heads of government about how to manage what has been, from the United States, fairly explicit threats against the territory of two other members of the alliance?
Frankly, we have not yet reached a common position on how to address this challenge. If you look at this from the perspective of Greece, for example, Greece has a strategic partnership with the U.S. It's a strategic partnership that transcends any given president. And it's a partnership I do want to nurture and I do want to strengthen. At the same time, I'm a member of the European family and a committed European. So we need to also manage the relationship with the U.S. Within the European context. So when we talk, for example, about tariffs and possible trade wars, I support the approach that the Commission has taken, which so far has been measured. And I was happy to see that President Trump decided to step down from his more aggressive tariff measures and give us 3 months to negotiate what could be a mutually advantageous trade arrangement.
But this must be particularly, I'm sure it's frustrating for every European country involved in this, but for a great great shipping nation such as Greece, which controls, I think, a fifth of the world's commercial shipping.
Almost a fourth. Yeah.
Almost a fourth, indeed. But you can't plan long term not knowing what the United States is going to do from one day to the next. So does Europe and indeed the rest of the world have to think about how we do remake an international trading order that doesn't necessarily have the US at the heart of it?
I cannot imagine Europe and the US breaking from each other when it comes to trade. China is
That's a confident thing to say this week.
it is indeed, but I would not be as confident if I spoke about China. So at the end of the day, Europe is based on an open sort of international order, a rules-based international order, which has free trade at its center. And certainly Greece, we're a small sort of open economy. We control, as you said, a quarter of the world's maritime fleet. 80% of the world's trade takes place via the sea, through ships. So we also have a strong interest in ensuring that goods, flow from country to country and continent to continent, because our shipping industry is providing this service. I do fundamentally believe that globalization has created such complex supply chains and interdependent interests, which will prove very, very difficult to break. And I think that the markets also send a very, very clear signal to the United States that very sort of aggressive decisions and measures will cause a significant short-term pain. And at the end of the day, the markets. We know something about this. Certainly for a small country, they are important, but I think they're also important for the world's largest economy, which is the US.
Is there a temptation, though, or will there be temptations for European countries, Greece in particular, perhaps given its dependence on maritime trade, to try and think of itself as maybe an exception in Donald Trump's thinking about Europe, and to try to think that, I know every country in Europe thinks it has a special relationship, but to think that maybe we are the special ones? Because you will know President Trump has always spoken actually quite highly of Greece. He seems to speak highly of you. He has done just in the last few days. Is there any temptation to think?
No, look, I'm not naive. We will not break with the majority of European countries when it comes to our relationship with the US. But again, when we talk about trade, this is primarily a European prerogative, so we need to be united. But when we talk about security and defense, then I think that national interests still play a very, very important role. For example, as I told you, we have a defense cooperation agreement that's been signed with the United States that is due to be renewed in 2026, and I do intend to renew it. So I think it's a difficult challenge to balance these relations, and we try to do it to the best of our ability, depending on which topic we talk about.
I do want to ask about some domestic aspects, because we're speaking here at the Delphi Economic Forum, which was rather upended by the fact of a general strike occurring in the middle of it. And a lot of this does still seem attached to this dreadful rail disaster of a couple of years ago. Are you surprised by the degree to which that seems to have been lit upon by a clearly not small number of Greek people as kind of a metaphor for everything? It often happens with a particular incident in the life of a country. We see it happening in Serbia at the moment, that something terrible happens, but people seem to think it represents something beyond it.
Well, I don't think there are any sort of profound similarities between what's happening in Serbia and what is happening in Greece. Certainly, this accident was a big collective trauma. And I've been very, very clear in terms of trying to letting justice, trying to get to the bottom of it, and making sure that those who are responsible will pay the price. Our responsibility is to ensure that this never happens again, and that we offer safe and reliable trains to Greek citizens, and that's what we are working on. Unfortunately, when things get very emotional and heated, lots of theories tend to sort of dominate the public discourse. Unfortunately, I don't think that we still know the whole truth, but I do know that this tragedy has been exploited by the opposition to hurt the government. And at the end of the day, this does not do service to justice, nor does it help the cause of especially of the relatives of those who lost their lives in this tragedy, who at the end of the day want the truth, they want justice, and they want to make sure that this never happens again.
Well, just finally then, I believe you have recently said that you intend to contest for re-election in 2027, and you hope to continue as Prime Minister. What do you still regard as unfinished business, if you think back to what you hoped you might be able to do for Greece when you got the job versus how far you've got with that project up until now? What is there still left to do?
So much. Look, this is a country that's in the process of a very profound transformation. I think we have received a lot of credit for our economic management. We're no longer the sick child of Europe. Our economy is outperforming the most European countries. When I look at, for example, the reforms that the German government is currently announcing, lots of those reforms we have already implemented.
You must be enjoying that irony in particular.
In Greece, I don't think it's. And I think I have a very open sort of discussion with incoming Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who has been very, very bold in terms of his announcements. But we still know that there is a lot of catching up to do in order to converge with Europe, and this remains our main priority. And this requires still important structural, deep reforms. Look, for example, at tax evasion. Everybody thought that this was endemic to Greece. Every single government in the past had committed to addressing this problem. No one succeeded. We have. And this is giving us a lot of fiscal firepower. So when I talk about returning the sort of collective wealth that we create back to citizens, this is exactly what I mean. We need more jobs. We have brought down unemployment from 17% to 8%. We want to bring it down to the EU average very quickly. I want higher wages. I want lower taxes. And in order to do that, you need a sound and strong fiscal position. Greece is currently consistently producing significant primary surpluses. Our borrowing costs have dropped significantly. So these are the foundations upon which we build all our policies. And rest assured, there is a lot of work to do until 2027. And there will be a lot of work to do post-2027 should the Greek people decide to again place their trust in us.
Prime Minister, thank you for joining us. That was Kyriakos Mitsotakis, Prime Minister of Greece. This is the Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our next guest joined us on the terrace outside one of the forum's temporary venues. Listeners might hear the conference hubbub and birdsong. You'll have to imagine the views sweeping down to the water. Paolo Gentiloni was Foreign Minister of Italy from 2014 to 2016, Prime Minister of Italy from 2016 to 2018 during the first administration of US President Donald Trump, and later European Commissioner for the Economy. I began by asking Mr. Gentiloni about the mood of the conference as everybody struggles to understand. Are we in a massive trade war with the United States or not?
Well, of course, the American roller coaster is also having an influence in Delphi. It's inevitable. We were yesterday morning completely in a trade war mood. And then the pause decision came from President Trump. And now everybody's discussing how serious this thing is, how long will it take. Ursula von der Leyen also adopted a European pause of 90 days a few hours ago. But I think this is not only Delphi. This is half of the world asking themselves what is the US president doing in the next hours.
Do you think at any level it might be better for everybody's decision-making if they understood that we were in a trade war with the United States? Because it must still be tempting for Europe to keep telling itself that Trump is an aberration. We just have to ride this out for another 4 years and it will all go back to normal.
Well, there is this risk. I think that for the European Union, President Trump's decisions should be taken as a wake-up call on several issues, from trade to defense, from industrial policy to geopolitical alliances. All this is something that will last independently of President Trump. President Trump is an accelerator, and the accelerator in interconnected world are very dangerous. But the trends, despite the acceleration, were there and will remain there.
But on the subject of that interconnectedness, does Europe and maybe the rest of the world other than the United States need to start thinking about how we work around the United States or without the United States? Because nobody can plan anything in the long term, especially on questions like defense, having to account for the fact that the United States might change its mind completely, not just every 4 years, but every 4 hours.
I think we should. The fact is that European Union has a special responsibility in its shoulders for simple reasons. First, we are the largest economy presently supporting free trade. And it is normal that the European Union work together to convene all the willings of free trade, from Japan to UK, from Latin America to South Korea to Norway, and you name it, Canada. So how can we work on this? I think we need time, probably, but an alternative. We can't leave the free trade die because of President Trump decisions. It's too dangerous, especially for us, for the European economy, depending from trade much more than China and the US. And secondly, and maybe even more difficult, we have to ensure our common defense as EU and as Europeans. It's not by chance that relation with UK restarted strongly after President Trump decisions and also after President Trump behavior. I think the meeting with President Zelensky in the Oval Office was a game changer in the awareness of the Western community.
Well, you would hope so, but is it important, do you think, that the EU continues to act in matters of economics and defence as one cohesive bloc? Because there will be countries, the one that you once led among them, that might start to think, well, we're a special case. We can forge our own relationship with the United States. We can be a bridge to Donald Trump.
Well, I think the cohesion of the European Union should not be underestimated. Because you are right, there are different opinions. We all know that there is a single country, which is Hungary, that has, in several geopolitical matters, a completely different point of view. But you were mentioned Italy. Italy is an interesting case, showing that despite the ideological and cultural proximity of our Prime Minister with President Trump, it is not at all a given that Italy will separate itself from the EU. Because at a certain moment you have to choose between ideological proximity and your national interests. And it's very, very difficult to choose against your national interests.
Is it clear to you, though, that Italy will always think that its interests are more closely allied with the EU than with the United States? And again, it's that thing of a country that might start to think we're special.
Well, every single country thinks
the United Kingdom.
Special.
The United Kingdom certainly does, for example.
Certainly, but even Bulgaria or Austria, they have a great past, and they think they are special, as we think as Italians. But the fact is that the common reaction was, in recent years, amazing. We were able to support Ukraine. We gave to Ukraine much more than the US, despite the fact that some countries, especially one of them, were against. And I'm sure that we decided a couple of days ago on retaliation tariffs, very moderate retaliation towards the US, and it was unanimous but one. So I think, referring to my own country, that the tradition of solidarity within the EU is very, very difficult to break, even from a government which is ideologically very close to President Trump.
Just finally, I want to go back briefly to where we came in, i.e. what has been going on in the United States. And I can't believe it's not even 100 days. But I know you wrote a book a few years ago called The Unpopulist Challenge. When you look at what's happened in the United States in particular, does this strike you as what happens when populism has a brush with reality?
Well, it's very impressive in my view what's happening in the US. Not only on foreign policy, we are of course looking a lot to foreign policy, to defense, to trade, But what is very impressive for me is it's happening to the universities, to the media.
And to be clear, you don't mean impressive in a good way.
To lawyers. How can such a strong democracy as America is to underestimate the rule of law in such a manner? So let's hope that this will change, because I repeat, it's not only about trade. It's about the pillars of the Western civilization, which is, yes, free trade, but first of all, it's liberty, democracy, and the rule of law.
Paolo Gentiloni, thank you for joining us. That was Paolo Gentiloni, former Prime Minister of Italy. This is the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. One does not require a long memory to recall the US Republican Party being a bastion of transatlantic solidarity. As recently as the early 1990s, the GOP gloried in having overseen victory in the Cold War, thereby liberating Europe from the predations of Moscow. Times have changed to a degree that may well disturb the eternal repose of Presidents Bush, Reagan, Nixon, and Eisenhower. So it may be that restoring the transatlantic alliance to what it was will necessitate a change of government in the United States, which will mean a Democrat in the White House, however unlikely that presently seems. I was joined on the same terrace by Meghan Hays, former Special Assistant to US President Joe Biden and Director of White House Message Planning from 2001 to 2022. I began by asking what she made of the Democrats' response to the second Trump administration so far.
So I think that Democrats have been a little slow to react. I also think that we have a little bit of an age problem with our different senators and House members. So I think that the response is not probably where it should be or where people, the rest of the country want it to be in the United States. So it'll be interesting to see how it takes shape heading into the midterms, but there really has not been a response.
I mean, how is the party, though, still apparently so unsure about how to respond to Trump? I mean, this is not now a new phenomenon. He's been a national political figure for a decade.
I think that the Democrats are playing by a different set of rules and a different rule book that's probably a little outdated, and Trump is turning the page and has a different way to communicate. He's much more on social media. He much more just says whatever he wants. He doesn't follow the rules or what we perceive as rules in the United States, and so I think that the Democrats we're caught flat-footed.
So what have the conversations been like over that period within Democratic communications and strategizing circles about how do we respond to this? Do we try to maintain the high road? Do we try to be the party of rules and decorum and convention versus do we actually just go out swinging?
So I think you have different opinions here, and I think you see different senators and members reacting differently. I think a good example is what the Midwestern governors are doing, who are very moderate and very much more where the rest of the country is, because the country is pretty much in the middle, and they're being very measured in their response. They're focusing on the economy. They're not being caught in culture wars. They're not responding to everything Trump says. Unfortunately, Congress isn't taking that same approach. You hear people swearing a lot, and you hear that getting caught in the news cycle significantly, and it just kind of is noise and loses its message, and I don't think that it's resonating with their constituents.
So do you think that might be a way forward then? Just don't take the bait, concentrate on actually governing and delivering results and making a meaningful difference to people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you take the bait on everything, then you stand for nothing. You know, it's that old saying, if you stand for everything, you stand for nothing. So Democrats, I think, need to figure out where they fit and what they're going to stand for and fight on the issues that are important to them and their constituents, which is the economy. All of this other stuff is noise. So focus on what you can change and what you can do, not on what you want to change or what you would wish you could change.
I mean, how frustrating has it been, though, in that, and again, you're right, the whole different rule book thing, and President Trump has proved an exception to so many rules. There are so many things about him which, even if you applied one of them to almost any other politician, would be career-ending and make them completely unelectable. Have the Democrats got caught in that trap over the last 10 years of, like, whatever the latest thing is, it's like, okay, this is it. Surely this will be what brings him down, and it never is.
No, because I think we need to realize nothing will bring him down. His base is extremely supportive, but that doesn't mean his base is supportive of J.D. Vance. It doesn't mean his base is supportive of other Republicans, and so I think we have to get through these 4 years, and we have to change the way we look at things and change the way we approach the different policies that we're going after. But I think that Democrats problem, and always has been a problem, is we let perfect be the enemy of the good. So each candidate has to be perfect on all 10 of their wish list, or they won't vote for them, and so they'll stay home. And that's not what Republicans do. And so I think we need to figure out how to convince our base and convince people that you can be okay with just liking 8 of these issues, but it's better than what's over here on the other side.
But there's a couple of assumptions there that you raise. One is that he won't try to run again in 4 years, and the other is that Trumpism stops with Trump. What happens if neither of those things turn out to be true? Either that he will, despite the fact that it would appear constitutionally impossible to stand for a third term, or it turns out that it's not just about one man, that this is a genuine movement.
So I think that the Republican base is really fractured on who they would support. I just don't think that anybody has a hold of the base like Trump does. They don't feel the same way about J.D. Vance. They don't feel the same way about John Thune, who's the leader of the Senate. They just don't feel the same way about him as they do with Trump. They see something in Trump they want to be. They see this celebrity. So I think that everyone, even Republicans, moderate Republicans, are hopeful that Trumpism stops with Trump. It just won't be as divisive, I think, as what it is now. And I think it is unconstitutional for him to run, so Congress would have to change an amendment. And I think this is where Democrats really need to step up. They need to take back the House in the midterm elections, and therefore they wouldn't be able to get a constitutional amendment.
But do you have concerns, or should the Democratic Party have concerns that might not be enough? I mean, what if, even if he doesn't have the numbers in Congress, if he just says, well, I'm going to run for the nomination, I will be a candidate in the primaries, the Republican Party nominates him anyway, and he says, well, what are you going to do about that?
Yeah, I mean, that is a concern, because that's his whole strategy. He always is like, I'm just going to do it. Fight me in court, and the Supreme Court has now ruled twice in his favor on things that everyone thought were unconstitutional or above the law. So I think that is a concern for people, and I think that we will cross that bridge when we come to it. Donald Trump is not a young person. He's not a young man, and I think that the country might not necessarily, if the economy doesn't change, people voted for Donald Trump because they did not like the Democrats' policies on the economy, and they didn't think they were better off 4 years ago than they were at the end. So I think that if the economy continues to go down and we're heading into a recession with his back and forth on tariffs, I think people won't vote for him. Republicans won't vote for him, so he won't win.
Do you think a plurality of his voters were really just thinking that coldly and rationally, though? There is something more atavistic and instinctive about this.
Yes.
There are personality cult aspects.
Oh, of course there are. But let's not forget, he actually did not win the majority of votes. He won enough to win the Electoral College, but he did not win the majority of votes. So I think that that's also something we should remember, and I think that Democrats need to do a better job at messaging. But there is a cult aspect to it. You can see it. You saw it when Joe Biden was president, and people would protest Joe Biden for random, Trump won the election. It's like we're living in an alternate universe, and I think it's a lot of how we get our news and get our information. It's very tribalism now in the United States.
I mean, I won't ask you to curse anybody by naming a prospective Democratic nominee for 2028. I won't ask you to name a who, but I will ask you about a what. If you're trying to assemble from this point the ideal Democratic presidential candidate in 2028, what are you looking for?
I'm looking for someone who's moderate and someone who's not going to fall victim to cultural wars, and who's going to ask our progressive left and our base to say, we understand you have issues here, but we need to win to even be able to look at your issues and take care of them. We can't do anything about this if we're not in power. And so I'm looking for someone probably pretty moderate, maybe a Midwestern governor, or someone who's in the middle, who understands both the Republican and the Democratic side, because a lot of the issues that we talk about are coastal issues. California and New York, those are people who care about them, but there's a lot of people in the middle of the country.
I mean, it would be a horrible concession to reality to have to make, but should the Democrats also consider the prospect that maybe just not enough Americans are ready for a president who isn't a white guy?
Well, that's true. They're not, and it's weird and shameful, but here we are. So I think that you're going to have to. I don't know that I will see a woman in my lifetime.
And just finally, if you think back to the last 4 years, the period in which you were working for President Biden, is there anything you would do differently if you had the chance?
I think that we should have been faster to communicate certain aspects of his agenda. I think that it got lost. All the positive things that he did in the first 2 years in his legislative agenda, I think got lost, and it got caught in the noise of his age or different cultural aspects, and I think that was a shame. We should have done a better job doing that.
But just on that thought, because it was a thought I had more than once, that if you applied Joe Biden's actual record as president to a notional mid-50-something with a full head of hair. It actually looked pretty impressive. Why did you struggle so much to get that across over the fixation on his age and apparent infirmity? Was this just something the media was determined to run with?
I think they were running with it from the beginning when he started running in 2019, but the American people decided they didn't care about his age in 2020, so it didn't matter as much. I think 4 years as the president also ages you significantly. Sure. You just behave differently. I also think that people in the United States don't necessarily care about what's going on in the rest of the world, and a lot of what he did as president impacted the rest of the world. And I think that fighting for people to be part of NATO, fighting with Ukraine, being really a force with Ukraine, I think that those are things that are important to democracy, but the United States and people in the United States didn't necessarily care because their inflation was so high and they couldn't afford groceries. So you can't combat that. If you can't afford certain things, then the other messages don't matter.
That was Meghan Hays, former special assistant to US President Joe Biden and director of White House message planning. Thank you for joining us. That's it for this special episode of The Foreign Desk, recorded at the Delphi Economic Forum. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.